Here we are in October.
And the first frost of the year is just days away.
And we're gonna show you what procrastination looks like on a flower farm. Let's take these seedlings for example. These are stock seedlings and they smell so good, but they absolutely should not be blooming in their trays.
And these are straw flower seedlings, and they should have been planted in the ground weeks ago. Yet, here we are.
What these seedlings are is a real life example of how optimism bias works. So today, we're gonna get some work done, explain exactly what that means, and what you can do about it. We're Rob and Kristi, and we're on a mission to cut ties with the traditional 9-to-5 suburban lifestyle.
And instead, follow our dreams of building a home, farm, and life in the Pacific Northwest.
Rob has spent over 2 decades in education.
And Kristi is a psychosocial researcher who has dedicated more than 10 years to studying people's experiences with creating meaningful lives.
We decided to put that research to the test, break free from living in the comfortable middle, and say yes to life by becoming our own experiment in cultivating a life well lived.
What we lack in qualifications and skill, we more than make up for with enthusiasm and grit.
So we're starting from the ground up and documenting the entire journey as we go. Several trays of seedlings that need to get into the ground right now. But before we can do that, we need to cover 2 of our rows with landscape fabric. And we do that because it helps to cut down on weeding later in the season, and it really does work. But it does take some time to get set up.
For our first row, we are burning holes with 6-inch spacing. So I made this template out of 1/4-inch plywood and a hole saw. I've made other templates out of sheet metal, and there's pros and cons to both.
I really like the sheet metal templates because they lay flat against the ground, unlike the plywood, which will warp over time. And the sheet metal templates will slide along the fabric as you're working, instead of having to pick up the plywood template and reposition it over and over as you're working.
But they take much more time to create. Using plywood is much faster.
Definitely. So if you're just starting out, I would recommend using the plywood until you know which spacing you're regularly going to use, and then you can cut it out as sheet metal once you know, which is something we really need to do with the 6-inch spacing because we use it all the time, but it keeps getting put off. Speaking of procrastinating.
In our previous episode, we talked about the experience of burnout, and a lot of people question whether they're dealing with genuine fatigue or just being lazy. And people often think they're maybe being lazy when they're procrastinating too.
But usually that's just not true. It's not like I'm sitting around binging Netflix or something. I am incredibly productive when I'm procrastinating. I'm just not doing the things that are actually priorities. And that's where the psychology of things gets a little interesting. Procrastination can happen for several reasons, but the important thing to know is that it happens on a psychological level. It's not laziness, and it's also not about learning better time management skills either. It's actually a problem with emotional regulation. That thing that we're putting off doing represents something undesirable in our subconscious mind, and there are many possibilities of what that might be. So instead of doing that thing, we do a whole bunch of other stuff that makes us feel pretty good so we can avoid the thing that we don't want to feel.
But it doesn't actually work because you're ultimately only causing yourself more discomfort by not facing the task head on.
Right. So we get a little bit of momentary relief while we're procrastinating, and it's like a little dopamine hit. And since our brains like rewards, we do it again and again and again and again, and it just becomes a vicious cycle.
And it can be really destructive to our physical and our emotional health.
And since there are like volumes of things we could say about procrastination, I think one of the most interesting components is optimism bias. It's something that 80% of us deal with, and it's something we know we deal with here on our farm.
So optimism bias is a cognitive bias that causes us to overestimate our chances of having a positive experience and then underestimating our chances of having a negative experience.
It's not totally a bad thing because it's part of grit, it's part of perseverance, it helps us with healthy striving and innovation, but it can also be part of the cause of procrastination when we fail to recognize the potential harm that we're doing to ourselves in the process. We trick ourselves instead into thinking that everything will turn out okay, even if we're putting off the thing that needs to be done. The way optimism bias shows up with our seedlings is that we know that statistically, the likelihood of those transplants surviving overwintering decreases every day that they're not in the ground. But we fool ourselves into thinking that we'll have more time and it'll be okay, when the reality is that's not true.
And how this plays out for us is quite often we assume we can complete projects in a shorter amount of time than what we actually need.
This has happened to us repeatedly, whether we're doing some home renovation project in our fixer-upper or we're doing something around the farm. Whatever it is that we plan always seems to take 30 to 50% longer than what we expect it should.
Yeah, so if we think something's going to take a week, it's more likely going to take more like 9 to 10 days.
Exactly.
Thank goodness we got the seedlings transplanted in time before the winter hit.
Absolutely, but procrastination is something that we're going to have to carefully manage if we want to make progress with this dream we have to build the farm. The big problem with all of this is that procrastinating leads to a dissonance between how we say we want to live our lives and how we actually do. And that gap can be the source of a whole lot of unhappiness and discontent in life. But the good news is that there is quite a lot that we can do about it. So let's first address this issue of optimism bias. It's that cognitive bias that causes us to overestimate the chances that even if we procrastinate, everything will turn out fine. One of the things you can do is simply to set more realistic expectations, which is harder than it sounds, but it definitely helps. And it's something we've been working especially hard at as we've started the new year and we've been planning our workload.
Since procrastination is at the core a problem with emotional regulation, another thing that can help is getting comfortable with the possibility of failure. If your relationship with failing is tied to your self-worth, or if you see failure as a sign to quit pursuing a goal, you're wrapping a lot of negative energy into the idea of doing anything that has any risk to it. Procrastination can end up being about avoiding those negative feelings, but it comes at a cost. The reality is that going after anything that's bigger than where you're at today comes with risks.
Right. One of the things to ask yourself is, what is the cost of the missed opportunities because you're playing fast and loose with reality? When we put off doing things that come with emotional risk, we end up living a smaller life with fewer opportunities and a whole lot more dissatisfaction. And then you loop that back to optimism bias, and you might trick yourself into believing that your life will still turn out the way you dream, but you'll wake up 5, 10, or 20 years down the road and realize it didn't. And you missed loads of opportunities to create what you really wanted. So quantifying those risks can help to temper optimism bias and help you stop procrastinating.
And when we're talking about procrastination as an issue with emotional regulation, we've got to talk about self-compassion. Really leaning into whatever you're feeling, whether that's fear, insecurity, self-doubt, whatever it is. These feelings come from somewhere, and maybe you've lived through some tough stuff, so treat yourself with kindness.
Yeah, because you're trying to rewire your psychology. So continuing to throw negativity on the fire by beating yourself up for how you feel only makes you feel worse, and then only makes it that much harder to get out of the loop. And that's the big key, is that you've got to give your brain a reward that's bigger and better than the procrastination in order to break the cycle. So think about your why. Why is this goal for how you want to live your life important to you? That's the tool that we're using every single day right now, because we're trying to make a major life change with our farm, and that's a tremendous undertaking that's only possible when we take the time to unpack what's getting in the way of the life that we say that we want versus the one that we're currently living.
And this internal work is never done.
Good point. No, it's not, because this is not something that you just fix and then it's all better. This is a practice that we're going to have to work on every day. And we've only touched on one little piece of it today, but tomorrow's going to bring new challenges and new ways for us to grow. And we have to keep doing the work every single day. And we will. So until next time, we hope that you're out there digging deep, cultivating those big dreams, and growing a life well lived.
Thanks for watching.
Chest out, head back, look him straight in the eye, and tell him, knocking it off.
I say, thank goodness we got our seedlings transplanted in time before the winter hit.
Potential harm that we're doing to ourselves in the process. Oh, sorry, there's like a mosquito right at my face. Oh. We trick ourselves psychologically into thinking that everything will still be okay.
That's an eagle.
Yeah.
Huh.
He was pretty.